morning, everyone. It's 10 Nisabho. Um, so for those who just joined or weren't here on Tuesday, we're going to be doing a different format on Fridays where um, one of us monks will be giving a talk alone, and Ajahn Chund has given me the opportunity to speak a bit, uh, give the majority of them as a bit of practice as well. So yeah, basically the format is we'll give a Dhamma talk basically for 30 minutes or so, and then have maybe 15 for questions. So hope that works for everyone. Another business point: next Tuesday evening at 6:30, when our usual session is with Ajahn Chunda and I, we won't have a theme. We'll just go with what questions come up. So feel free to bring questions that you'd like to speak about, and we'll go from there. All right. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So today I wanted to speak about the a word that doesn't get used much in Buddhist circles, but is, I think, one of, for me, the most beautiful words in the English language in the Western spiritual tradition, and that's grace. And I think people can be confused or not know where this word, which is so important in the Christian tradition, fits into the whole Buddhist framework. And maybe that's because it's such a broad concept. You know, it covers everything from an acknowledgement of our brokenness to the healing and gift of life and love that comes with that acknowledgement. And it also connects to the idea of grace of movement, or of bringing one's motions and actions in harmony, maybe with a deeper purpose, or almost rhythm in life, or current. And I think this is a relevant reflection right now, this word, because for me, I think the most clear place where grace makes its way into the Buddhist teaching is at the point of the First Noble Truth. And so for those who have heard, say, old translations of the Four Noble Truths, suffering, the origin of suffering, namely craving, the cessation of suffering, which is nibbana, and the path leading to that cessation, or the Noble Eightfold Path, then these can be mistranslated as the First Noble Truth can sound like this sort of dour statement that all life is suffering. But I think it's much more useful to look at what the Buddha was actually advising us to do with each truth. Every truth comes with a duty. So the First Noble Truth is a directive to understand and comprehend suffering. The Second Noble Truth is the directive to abandon its cause, craving. The Third Noble Truth is the instruction to realize its cessation, or nibbana. And the Fourth Noble Truth is to cultivate the path leading to that cessation. And those four duties are roughly based on ancient Ayurvedic medicine. I think the directive in the First Noble Truth to look at and understand suffering is a really beautiful one if it's understood correctly, because I take it as the encouragement to look to our pain and what we spend most of our lives running at breakneck pace away from, our discontent, the feeling like things aren't quite right. Um, it's the Buddha's instructions that one has to turn towards that and understand it. And that when one does that, it loses its power and becomes uh, a source of intimacy with life and compassion. I'm reminded of the story of, I think it was Chogyam Trungpa. Um, when he was in Tibet, there's a story of him and an entourage of high lamas went to a monastery, and there's these huge Tibetan mastiffs, which the monasteries in Tibet use to guard the temples. And it broke its chain and it ran headlong at the group of monks. And all the other monks ran away, but Chogyam Trungpa ran straight at the dog. And the dog was so put out that it turned around and ran away from Chogyam Trungpa. And um, I think it's a similar dynamic with our suffering. As long as we are running from it and turning away from it, then it has immense power over us, and our entire lives are dominated by that search for some escape. When I finished college, I sort of had felt this process really becoming more and more powerful in my life, and I was driving down the 101 down California's coast looking into grad schools for psychotherapy. And I just remember being at the end of 3 days of driving, constantly listening to podcasts, reading the new Hunger Games, watching movies wherever I stopped. Just the sort of culmination of this headlong rush for stimulus and escape, which had gathered momentum through my college years. And I had a really blessed childhood and youth and life in every way. And yet still, there was not only the sort of sufferings which we all have, um, the pain of losing someone you love or not feeling adequate, but also just the fact that all the things which used to give me happiness, they just lose their poignancy over time. And I think this happens in our late teens and 20s and on into life, is things just begin to crust over until it's as if you're living life through a sheet of glass or a pane of glass. Um, I think the Buddha would characterize it as the sankharas, which these programs, ways of acting and thinking that we've developed to negotiate the world and protect ourselves. They just gain their own momentum, and soon they accumulate such that we no longer have access to uh, the freshness of life at all anymore. And things become dull and bland, and we find ourselves running headlong more and more after what pleasure we can have. And um, and this is a great and insidious kind of tragedy about in life, is this fall from grace, which is such a theme. The beauty of being a child and having that intimacy with the world, and then its slow and almost unnoticed loss until we're adults. And for many of us, somehow alienated from not just the external world and the freshness and beauty which we once had access to, but also to our own internal uh, sense of purpose and joy and our spirit, whatever you want to call it. So for me, that moment at the end of college, driving down the coast, really was the culmination of that. It was just this sudden seeing, this frantic search for something to distract myself. And then I'd been meditating for a while, but on the way back on from that trip, I thought I'd stop by Abhayagiri, the monastery associated with our tradition north of San Francisco. And I remember walking into that silence after 3 days of constant stimulus and just being uh, completely moved by the absolute silence and space held in that monastery, and realizing that if I was to ever turn around and face, these demons and the suffering, that I needed help stopping. And that is what catalyzed me taking robes. So where grace fits into this for me is the fact that what the Buddha was advising us to do was to turn towards our suffering, and that we needed help to do this. That sort of the heart's palsied shaking, which we find ourselves so taken by as we grow older. We need discipline and a spiritual community to hold us, and that when we turn towards that pain, it loses its power. And that's the point of the story with Chogyam Trungpa running towards the dog, but that there's no neutral position to suffering. Either you're running headlong away from it, or you're very consciously turning towards it and touching it and holding it with careful hands. And so this, I think, is the beginning point of grace. The fact that when we do turn towards our pain, that what opens from there is the other three noble truths. That when we turn towards the pain and see the craving, the desperation driving it, the thirst, and have compassion for ourselves in that, when we see those things, when we stop running, then suddenly the cessation, the third noble truth, cessation is a problematic word, but peace opens more and more, and the path becomes clear. And it all begins with turning towards our pain. And I think that grace, which is a word taken from the Christian tradition, has a similar implication of when we truly rest in humility and an acknowledgement of our brokenness and imperfection, then the majesty of what we really are and of what is transcendent can manifest, and true gratitude and communion with life has a chance to touch us again. And this, for me, this movement through the dark valley to the kingdom of heaven, through the first noble truth to the other three, that's the essence of grace. The fact that when we turn towards our suffering finally, that from there something opens in us which is bigger than that suffering, and which knows it as not a problem. And obviously there's always the suffering of life. You know, in Buddhism, we speak about two arrows. The first arrow is the suffering of the five aggregates of the khandhas, just the fact that these things we take as ourselves change. The people we love pass, our bodies decay. We are imperfect, we're neurotic, etc. But then there's and these are things that one can not only live with, but that lend people their beauty in the end. And then there's the second arrow, which is the unnecessary one. And this is the arrow that the whole of the Buddhist training is directed to keep us from shooting ourselves with and to help us draw out. And this is the arrow of the compounded suffering, of the suffering of craving, of wanting it to be otherwise, of investing in things that aren't worthy of us. And this is the suffering which we can give up. And when we do find a way to let that go, then the way we exist with that first arrow, with the conditions, imperfect as they are, of ourselves and of our life, is a mode of being that is grace incarnate. And that's the Sangha. That's what enlightened beings live. So I think there's an interesting sutta here. It's one called Transcendent Dependent Origination, and it only appears once, maybe twice in the canon, as far as I know. But it's one of my favorite suttas, and it begins by describing the usual chain of dependent origination from which the Buddha stated that all suffering comes. So, ignorance leads to sankhara, these programs, to consciousness, to feeling, so on through craving, birth, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And the usual mode of this chain that brings about our pain and our unnecessary suffering based on ignorance is that it is a feedback loop that compounds and compounds and spirals. And you see that in life very clearly. But in this sutta, Transcendent Dependent Origination, the Buddha runs through the 12 links that lead to our pain, to suffering, to dukkha. But then there's a pivot point where he says, suffering is the condition for faith to arise, and faith is the condition for joy. Joy is the condition for effort for rapture. I'm mixing, I think it actually might be first effort, virya, then joy, then rapture, and so on through unification of mind and liberation. And what's so profound about this is that it presents the possibility of a moment where in our deepest suffering, at the very end of that whole chain, something changes and there's a space where grace comes in. And instead of continuing the same cycles of ignorance which have chased and hounded us and controlled us for so many years and lifetimes, instead, one finds faith. One intuits an escape. And there's another sutta where the Buddha says that there are two reactions to suffering. One is um, bewilderment, and the other is a search. And this pivot point where one chain of dependent origination that is dark suddenly turns into the possibility of a bright um, series of movements in the practice is a profoundly beautiful thing to think about, I think. And for me, that pivot point comes usually with a sense that it's not us doing it, it is a gift. And for me, that was what happened at Abhayagiri, for example. That one moment was the sudden intuition that there was a way out and that I needed to dedicate everything I had to that. And I think many of us have those intuitions at different points. I know that I've had a few in my life. The one was when I first read Siddhartha, which in some ways is not a very Buddhist book, but um, the sense of brightness which came from that and of intuiting a path that was true to the deepest aspect of myself is something that has guided my life ever since. The other moment would be when I followed a monk first on Bindabat, alms round in Thailand. And I think sometimes these moments where we are given this gift of realizing what we are made for, um, namely the realization of truth, of our true potential, um, they come sometimes with this sense of stepping into a footprint which was made for you, made for us. And I think we're given a few moments like that in life as gifts that direct us. And it's important to guide our lives by those moments. But much more frequently, I think that the spirit, the Dhamma, speaks in a quieter voice. Rarely, I think, is it the voice of a lion. I think much more often it's the voice of, or it's more of the shape of a deer or something shy and sweet. And I think that's where meditation practice comes in, is that when we spend our lives frantically running from our pain and trying to fill every waking moment with distraction, with gadgets, even with very wholesome things, outdoor activities constantly. I love hiking and stuff, but there comes a point where you see that it's being used to distract. And if we spend our whole lives running from our pain, then there's no space for those quieter voices to speak, and we lose our ability to hear our own inner voice and the voice of the Dhamma and grace. And we lose access to that grace, for that potential. We lose the ability to, by turning towards the First Noble Truth in ourselves, our own pain, to be given the others, to be given and have access to the peace, nibbana, and the path leading to that, and its intuition. And that's another important point for me, is that I think one way of looking at why the Noble Truths are ordered as they are is that from that place of acknowledging suffering, there does come a moment of stillness, of peace. And then from there, we gain a sense of our path, which is the fourth Noble Truth. And that this is also part of grace, of what's given to us, and is one of the most sustaining elements of the Dhamma. And I think we've all sensed that. If you're on this live stream right now, if you've begun to practice sincerely, you know what it feels like to get a sense more and more for what is truly worthy in your life, and that is the practice of Dhamma, the cultivation of the heart. And that when you step into that stream of Dhamma, it holds you, and there's a sense of being carried. And for me, that's very much part of the idea of grace. And not just of being carried, but that you've brought your life in tune with a greater harmony. And that this is gives great strength. And that this sense of purpose and of deepening purpose is one of the greatest blessings of a life. I know Nietzsche said that with the right why, we can bear any how. So with the right purpose, we can bear any circumstance. And I think the fact that the practice of Dhamma changes everything in life to an opportunity to cultivate the heart, no matter how trivial or small the external activities, if we are approaching them with mindfulness and with an attention to the Four Noble Truths, looking for the suffering, for our own defilement, and abandoning it at every possible moment, then our lives can become a profound blessing to ourselves. And we know that we're living a life worthy of our death, worthy of our potential. And words like destiny and purpose are problematic in the Buddhist tradition because things are conditioned and we have choice. But the Buddha does also acknowledge the orderliness of Dhamma. There are these three characteristics he holds as a counterpoint to the changeability of all things. It is also this orderliness of dependent origination. And that orderliness for me speaks to how when we see how something has come into being, when we truly understand conditions, we don't feel things are wrong. We know that things are as they should be, even if they are wrong in a sense that we need to take action and change something. Still, we can act from a place of love and of acceptance, even as we change those conditions. So this gift of purpose is the most, for me, profound gift that the Dhamma gives us, apart from the end realization. But for most of us, this is enough to sustain a life. And if we lack this purpose, then life is a series of disconnected and painful events. And some pleasure in there, but no meaning. And the only way I think that we hear the voice of what's inside us telling us what that path is by cultivating meditation on a regular basis, on stepping back from our obsessions and our thoughts, and opening a space every day where that small voice can speak, and that it becomes stronger and stronger. I asked a Catholic nun I knew, who is a wonderful nun named Florence in Spokane, where I grew up, what had sustained her on her monastic path. And she said, eventually, the voice of God inside becomes the most important thing to you, beyond everything else. And I think while we Buddhists don't reify it quite as much, the voice of Dhamma and the voice of what we know to be right is a similar voice. And that the grace that comes from listening to that voice in terms of what it gives us in stability, in purpose, and in happiness is a profound gift. And so just an encouragement to maintain a meditation practice regularly. I'm sure most of you do already. I think 20 minutes in the morning and the evening is a good standard minimum. But if my sense from speaking to people and from my own practice is that when one increases meditation time to 45 minutes sessions twice a day or once a day at the very least, a sea change does happen in practice where there's a whole new kind of level of openness to life that comes. And then another sea change seems to come around 2 hour-long sessions, but that's very hard for people to find the time for. But I think even just 20 minutes a day, which I'm sure most of you are still cultivating, opens a space where the spirit can speak and where we have a chance to turn towards our pain and to pass through that dark valley of death, of the shadow of death, and come into a light, which is our birthright as human beings if we know how to look for it, and of a purpose greater than just constant distraction. And I think we must recollect regularly what a gift it is that we are given such purpose and path. So, I meant to speak about breath meditation too, but I don't think that's going to happen this session. So I'm going to open this computer now, and I think we have a chance for 10 or 15 minutes of questions slash discussion, depending on how much energy I have. It's good to see everyone. Yeah, so hopefully we're still running. Any thoughts or things people would like to speak about? Questions around anything is fine. Mm. Is it a good idea to do pranayama yoga breathing before meditation? Asks Sunny. Good morning, 2 a.m. Wow, sadhu. um, Pranayama yoga breathing before meditation. I'm not terribly familiar with the yogic systems of breathing, but my sense around breathing and breath meditation is that yes, it can be really helpful to work with the breath before sitting. And this is, I think, one of the great disservices that's been done in terms of the Dhammas coming to the West has been the constraining mindfulness of breathing to just the idea of breath at the tip of the nose. Like that's where you need to bring your mind right at the beginning. Whereas when the Buddha spoke about breath, he spoke about in the Anapanasati Sutta, the mindfulness of breathing sutta, the third step is to become aware of the whole body, sabakaya, and to calm the bodily formations, which could be thought of as the breathing, but also as the breath body, the subtle energies. And the word for breath in Pali is pana, which corresponds to the Hindu pranya, or to chi, the wind element. And so with this interpretation of breath, then breath meditation becomes much more, and I find that this approach works much better for most Westerners. It's as Ajahn Jeff teaches it. Ajahn Suchito teaches it this way as well. Ajahn Jayasaro teaches it this way. Tenpor Lee one of the great masters in our tradition taught it this way, is to really work to expand the scope of the breath. So to visualize the breath not just as the wind passing through the nostrils, but as energy passing through the whole body. And I find that the Hindu or Vedic systems, the yogic systems of visualizing the breath energy, along with the Chinese systems, Taoist systems, they call it the microcosmic orbit. It's a very good model. So in that system, the breath energy will run down the central meridian and then like down the front of the body and then up the spine. And I know many breathing exercises are focused at getting the breath moving in that orbit. And um, for me, that's the sense of the third step of the Anapanasati Sutta is when you're getting, becoming aware of the whole body, it's becoming aware of sort of this whole flow of energy. And you can just do that by either visualizing light, um, coursing down the body. Ajahn Jeff has a few very good instruction manuals online around with each and every breath. It's what its title is. But also the fourth step of the mindfulness of breathing sutta is calming bodily fabrications. And those bodily fabrications, I think, can also be conceptualized as those knots in our body that are associated with trauma and pain. So, for example, say a knot at the throat or a tightness in the chest associated with fear. And as the breath energy begins to move, it can release those, and that's the calming of them. And as they release and calm, then the breath energy flows very naturally. And that's when the next steps of the mindfulness of breathing sutta, which is the experiencing of rapture and pleasure, become very apparent. Because when the breath energy begins to circulate without those blockages, it's a source of immense refreshment and pleasure. So, um, these techniques in Taoist circles, like Qigong, this is one of the great secrets of our tradition, is many of the senior teachers practice Qigong. Ajahn Sucitto teaches it regularly at retreats, and it's very effective. Um, and I think probably the yogic breathing you're referencing might have a similar ethic around it. I'd be curious. But the point is, for many of these techniques, they're an expedient means. As Westerners, we just are sort of stuck in our heads and completely alienated from our bodies, which makes cultivating this whole body awareness virtually impossible at first, unless we're very conscious about it. And it's very helpful to have an expedient means before you sit to drop the awareness from the head to the heart. So that could be standing exercises in Qigong, um, could be going for a run, or it might be these yogic breath exercises as well. But whatever you can do to drop the awareness out of the head, to relax the diaphragm, to open up this whole other realm of the breath body is very helpful in terms of cultivating a broad and effective technique of anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, would be my answer. And if you can do that at 2 a.m., then you have my, then I'm impressed. Okay, yeah, next week we can speak more about breathing, Patty, definitely. I think there's the other element of grace is, I think, the idea of grace of movement and what we're speaking about in terms of the very practical approach of getting the breath energy to circulate around the body and um, the sense of rapture, piti, and pleasure, which arise from that, and which the Buddha points to in the um, mindfulness of breathing sutta. That's a sense of, for me, of a internal and very practical grace of movement. Is you're taking out all the blockages and stress points, and um, yeah, an immense sense of well-being can come from that, and stillness. But it's a very practical application of it. And yeah, moving through the steps of the Anapanasati Sutta with that in mind is very fruitful exercise. That sutta is an astounding sutta. I continually get more out of it. Would you name the sutta again on transcendent dependent origination? Thank you. Um, yes, there's a similar one that I remember right off. I think it's Anguttara 10.6 Volition Sutta. It's different, but it's related. It's saying for one who, um, God, what is it? For one who is joyful, no effort must be made. Let rapture arise in me. Um, it is natural that for one who is joyful, rapture arises. And it goes on through all those steps, saying how the natural progression of each of these bright links is the next one. So that's Anguttara 10.6 Volition Sutta. The Transcendent Dependent Origination Sutta, I think you can literally type in transcendent, I can't type it right now. Type in Transcendent Dependent Origination and you should be able to find it. If I'll also look it up for next week and try to find the exact reference. I think it appears maybe twice. I think it's in Anguttaras, but I could be wrong. But it's a really important sutta, and it's very inspiring for me. The inflection point between suffering and search. Great, yeah. I'm glad people appreciated the reflection on grace. I mean, we in the West, I think we've had problems with Christianity and completely legitimate ones. But when we don't acknowledge the beauty in that tradition, we lose a great deal, especially since much of our um, sort of internal um, subconscious thoughts and images are couched in Christian imagery. So I find that a lot of those concepts and words can strike very deeply at the heart. For example, the Buddhist conception of, say, devas, heavenly beings. I mean, we know what that might be, whether or not you believe in them. But just think of the contrast between that word and the word angel, or between like this word grace. Um, and there's other parallels which are very interesting. They're imperfect, but I think if we can find ways of speaking to some of these concepts which Christianity has developed, uh, while in a Buddhist context, while acknowledging that the translation is not perfect, the Buddha's language is very precise, and there's danger in bringing these concepts too much over. But there's very interesting other parallels. For example, the concept of original sin in Christianity was originally, I think, translated as hamartia, which means missing the mark. And the concept of sin as just a missing the mark, it aligns somewhat with the idea of dukkha, where I've heard the etymology of dukkha being a wheel which doesn't quite run correctly, which doesn't quite fit into its hub. Um, and I think if sin could be thought of more along the lines of sort of missing the mark, we might be able to speak to it a little more. But once again, these are interesting contemplations for a talk, but to acknowledge that to go too far in that direction risks uh, speaking imprecisely around things that the Buddha was very precise around. And we don't want to be too careless in bringing in those terms. But there is a place, I think, for at least acknowledging some resonance points. So for me, grace is one of the great orphans of the language that we haven't managed to quite find a place for in the Buddhist tradition. And if there was some way of at least pointing to resonance points, that would be of service. Okay, so that might be enough for this week. I'm sorry what questions that I didn't get into many. Oh, Upanisa Sutta. That's it. That's it. Yes. Adam Gibbs just pointed to the transcendent dependent origination sutta, and it is indeed the Upanisa Sutta. Upanisa. I don't know what. Oh, 12.123. That's it. Great. Okay, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, we'll be this will be every Friday in the mornings, 7 a.m. And once again, it's a real gift to be a part, even virtually, of this community of practitioners. It's a profound resource that we have, and the Kali and Nimitta available in that is a lot of it's a great inspiration. So, thank you. Take care.